Why was the basketball court all wet? Because the players kept dribbling on it.
The dad joke. Corny, groan-worthy, but also one of the simplest ways to share a moment with your kids.
What did the buffalo say when he dropped his son off for school? Bye, son.
So take a moment to make your kid laugh, because dad jokes rule. Make your kid laugh today. Go to fatherhood.gov. Brought to you by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the Ad Council.
Widely considered the best African-American basketball player of his time, Cumberland Posey was an exceptional multi-sport athlete who played from the early 1900s to the mid-1920s. After leading Duquesne University in scoring for 3 seasons, he created, managed, and played for the legendary Loendi Big Five. His team was the most dominant of the Black Fives era, winning 4 straight colored basketball world championships. At the same time he was starring on the hardwood, Posey was also a legend on the diamond as a talented center fielder and club owner. He is now the only individual to be enshrined in both Cooperstown and Springfield.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hello, gang. What is going on? My name is indeed Tim Hanlon, and I appreciate you finding our little show we like to call Good Seats Still Available, our curious little journey each and every week into what used to be in professional sports. Thanks for finding us. People call me all kinds of things. The captain of contraction, I've been called the evocateur of expansion, the professor of previously domiciled. I also go by the doctor of defunct, the reverend of relocation, whatever you choose to call me. Again, of course, please keep it clean. It's a family show to some extent. I am your humble host and the chief ringleader of the frivolity and intrigue that we somehow find something to do each and every week around this crazy topic that we've made for ourselves, that the teams and leagues and various things that are no longer with us for whatever reasons. And we love any opportunity to go back to what we're going to get into this week again, the Negro Leagues. And we have our return guest, Jim Overmyer, who you may remember from an episode, I guess it was about 4 or 5 maybe weeks ago. We talked about the Atlantic City Bacharach Giants. Atlantic City's really own, or only ever real quote unquote major league professional team of any sort. Fascinating discoveries there, Boardwalk Empire and all. But Jim has a brand new book out. It came out just a couple of months ago, just before the pandemic outbreak and all the craziness and other things that have sort of engulfed our world since. But it's a great book and an amazing topic where I learn an incredible amount. And we talk about the life of one Cumberland Posey. He of not only the Homestead Grays, he was the founder and the player and the manager and the owner of the longtime legendary Negro Leagues, plural, different leagues, different environments, team that played in suburban Pittsburgh, sort of Homestead, Pennsylvania, but also in Washington, D.C., as we've kind of alluded to with some of our previous chats about baseball in D.C. Yes, the Homestead Grays were kind of, over a period of time, kind of a dual city kind of situation. But this guy, Cumberland Posey, not only was he substantial in the creation, the running, and the legacy of this incredible and arguably one of the most memorable Negro League teams, the Homestead Grays. As we discover in our conversation with Jim in just a couple of moments, Cumberland Posey was, and by the way, not only a baseball Hall of Famer in 2006, posthumously, of course, but also a legendary and seminal basketball player as well, back in the Black Fives era, or also known as early black basketball. The Black Fives era were kind of like the pre-National Basketball Association and the leagues that kind of preceded that, the NBL and the Basketball Association of America and these various industrial teams that we've talked about in previous episodes as well. But this is almost like sort of the basketball equivalent of the Negro Leagues that is in basketball. And this Black Fives era is something we want to go much deeper in, but this is a great shoehorn into the beginnings of that exploration. You're talking about teams, I mean, dozens of them in the era from roughly about 1904, 1905 or so until, arguably until about 1950 or so, when the NBA finally became a thing as well as racially integrated. And we're talking about like teams that they were called quints sometimes, or colored fives or Negro fives, or more simply and more reverentially now referred to as Black Fives. We're talking about many, many teams in places like Philadelphia and Cleveland and New York and D.C. and Chicago and Pittsburgh. And Cumberland Posey was arguably, not so arguably, regarded as one of the greatest players of that era. And frankly, as his induction into the Naismith National Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame as well in 2016. Yes, a Baseball Hall of Famer inductee in 2006 posthumously, and the Basketball Hall of Fame in 2016. 2006 for baseball, 2016 for basketball. There you go. This is a guy who is regarded as one of the best basketball players of all time, not only just the Black Fives era. And this is a fascinating story of a phenomenal athlete and sportsman and manager and runner of teams and owner and all that kind of stuff in sports that is just an amazing discovery that we get into with our guest this week, Jim Overmyer. And his book is called Come Posey of the Homestead Grays, a biography of the Negro Leagues owner and Hall of Famer. But as you'll hear in our chat and as well in the book, it's really a misnamed kind of title because we spend half of the conversation talking about not only the Homestead Grays and Posey's baseball legacy, but the Black Fives era basketball realm that Posey was instrumental in as well. It's sort of a dual-natured conversation with Jim coming up in just a few moments. It is fascinating stuff, and the book absolutely well worth the read. You will learn a lot, as I did. Before we get there, I want to say thank you, continued thanks, as always, to one of our oldest and most loyal of sponsors. That's our pal Dean Mitchell in beautiful San Diego, California, and it's sportshistorycollectibles.com. It is the well-lit, better version, more curated and lushly photographed site of all kinds of memorabilia from leagues that, in Dean's words, thrived, failed, and shaped the North American sports landscape of today. Sportshistorycollectibles.com. You pick the sport, you'll probably find an item or two or dozen or so, whether that's baseball or basketball or soccer or hockey or football, hell, even Olympic sports and other sports that didn't have leagues per se. All amazing stuff. Again, well curated, well lit, beautifully photographed, and available for consideration and purchase. This is stuff you're not going to find on eBay, and you know and you can trust the source. High quality service is what Dean and his friends are all about. And of course, we've got a promo code for you. We would not leave you hanging without such. And that's the promo code is Good Seats. One word, Good Seats. That's the promo code at sportshistorycollectibles.com. Again, sportshistorycollectibles.com. Promo code Good Seats for 15% off all of your great memorabilia purchases when you go there early and often. And we tip our Homestead Grays cap in the general direction of Dean Mitchell and his friends at sportshistorycollectibles.com. Check them out, support the show, and we appreciate it to no end. We also appreciate you listening to our fine chat, our return visit with Jim Overmyer. Here we go. Let's get into the Homestead Grays and the Black Fives era basketball story of Cumberland Posey. What an amazing character this guy was. Here's our chat we had just a couple of weeks ago, and please enjoy. Why don't you give our audience a sense of who you are? You know, the proverbial day or night jobs or previous careers, and then maybe sort of skate into where the interest in just Negro League baseball generally came from, and then we'll slide into second base, I guess, with the Cumberland Posey story.
Okay. Well, I'm a retired financial management type from New York State government, and my wife and I moved to Tucson, Arizona, to get away from the snow. We sold our snowblower and gave away our snow shovels and moved to the Southwest 2 years ago. I had been a newspaper reporter at one time, so I've written a lot over the years. I'm also a member of the Society for American Baseball Research, and I attended a meeting at the Hall of Fame in 1988, and it was on a weekend, and my wife had never been to the museum, so she came along. Her name is Ellen Wyden. And she didn't want to go to the meeting, obviously, so she went through the museum. And we're out of town. We're going out of town, and we are stopped at the only stoplight in downtown Cooperstown, New York. And she says, "So who is this Effa Manley anyway?" And I'm a big baseball person. I said, "Who? I have no idea who you're talking about." "Well, there's a Negro Leagues exhibit in the hall, and she was a prominent civil rights advocate and owner of a team in Newark, and she's really interesting. You should write something about her." And I said, "Okay, sure." And then nothing much happened. I actually started to research a little, but nothing much happened. And then a year later, I met a guy who became my good friend and mentor, Larry Hogan, from around Newark, who had arranged for the donation of Effa Manley's business papers, which had been left behind in her house in Newark when she moved away in the early 50s, and somehow didn't get thrown out, burned up, flooded, or anything in the basement of this house. He arranged for them to be donated to the Newark Public Library. It's the single biggest source of primary material in the Negro League. So I then made 20 or 25 trips to Newark from around Albany to look at these papers over a year or two, and resulted in, I never thought in my life I would write a book, but it resulted in a book, Queen of the Negro Leagues, a biography of Effa Manley, who was a contemporary owner of our man Cumberland Posey. So that's how I got into it. I just fell right into it. It's a fascinating topic. I've got three books, 3.5, I guess you could say, because the Manley book is now out in a second edition this year. So books of my own, and contributed to other people's books, and a member of the SABR Negro Leagues committee, and it just took me over. I do nothing about this, almost nothing about this branch of baseball before my wife spoke up at the stoplight.
Well, no, and good for her. And frankly, we should have her on the episode here to kind of explain how important she is to all this. Obviously, our little silly show is focused on sort of this broad yet very niche and arguably borderline obsessive sort of fascination with various teams and leagues and stuff that don't exist anymore. And obviously, the further back you go, the more quote unquote historical it gets. But and we've talked to Bob Luke a little bit about Effa Manley, and we've certainly talked about teams like the Kansas City Monarchs. But it's interesting as you sort of go back into the baseball thing, which, by the way, baseball probably the most thoroughly researched and obsessively statisticized, if that's a word, I just made one up, of all the sports, right? And arguably the longest lasting of American sports, and that's partially why. But what is it about the Negro Leagues specifically that is so, at least in my mind, endlessly fascinating? I got to guess, I'll throw out my sort of 2 cents, is that some of it, frankly, is still, I wouldn't call it undiscovered, but is still I guess the historical markings of what transpired during those leagues and the relative ragtagness of what those were. It seems to me still prime for unearthing new and fascinating stories and tidbits and pieces of information, say, versus the more, I guess, standardized, white side of baseball, so to speak. It just seems like the stories are more colorful and the intrigue is higher for these Negro Leagues. But that's my 2 cents. How about you?
I agree with you. The real attraction is, well, the history curve or arc or whatever of the Negro Leagues is very strange because they weren't completely ignored by the white press, but obviously they got much more play when they were active in the black newspapers. And then integration, Jackie Robinson, Larry Doby, Satchel Paige, and all of that, killed off the Negro Leagues. I mean, they were segregated. They operated in their own realm, mostly catering to black fans, although not entirely, and mostly covered by the black newspapers, although not entirely. But then when the best black players started to appear in the previously white Major League Baseball, the fans all flocked to see them, and the Negro Leagues died out. They were basically undermined by the early 50s and completely defunct by 1960, and frankly, nobody cared about them anymore. And then they started to get rediscovered in the 70s. The Hall of Fame put together a special committee in 1971 and elected the first 9 Negro Leaguers to the Hall, and books started to be written, basically a lot of them based upon real live interviews. A lot of the best players were still alive then, and so they were interviewed and books were written. And so in the 70s, and then the whole thing it dipped down, and then it sort of came back. It became something that people were interested in. And what you discover is the Negro Leagues, yes, they were kind of ragtag at times. They were financially disadvantaged because their main fan base had less money than Major League Baseball's fan base, very susceptible, very sensitive to financial, economic downturns, the Great Depression being the main one. So they had, some of the leagues didn't last very long, and some of the lesser teams would fire up and last a couple of years and disappear. But in the end, it developed. That was where the good black players developed. The best of the first wave of black players in the majors: Willie Mays, Jackie Robinson, obviously, Hank Aaron, Ernie Banks, Roy Campanella, all got their early training in the Negro Leagues. So they weren't set up to be the feeder system for Major League Baseball, but in fact they were, and had they not existed, I don't know where those guys would have developed their talents to have broken that barrier and set the stage for real integration. So that's why they're important.
Yeah, it's a fascinating tableau, and it's to me it's just and folks who are listening to this episode will probably also want to search up our other episode with you, talking about one of those teams, the Atlantic City, New Jersey Bacharachs. But let us turn our attention to the matter at hand here. Our excuse, we always look for tangents and raison d'etre, so to speak. Obviously, is a team within that sort of firmament known as the Homestead Grays, but in particular, a gentleman that I also, I guess, maybe would like you to introduce, but maybe also in the introduction of him and his role that we'll get into. How does he get into your consciousness too? Given that you've been focused on the Effa Manley story, he says. How does he become your next target, so to speak, of interest?
Well, he was a contemporary. Effa's Newark Eagles were active in the league at the same time as the Homestead Grays. In fact, they were by the mid-'40s were probably the 2 best teams in the league. So in following the Manley story, of course, I learned about all these other owners, and some of them are interesting and some of them are not so interesting. Well, Posey was kind of fascinating. I actually started to research him 20 years ago. And I came to at one point I wrote a paper on him for a seminar, and I says, I really don't like this guy. So I stopped working on him. And of course, that was very naive. Of course, if
why did you not like him, do you think?
Well, he was he was a very domineering and somewhat abrasive character up front. And I said, man, this guy is kind of an SOB. Of course, I came to realize if no one wrote biographies of people who weren't nice, then what would we know about Napoleon or Genghis Khan or anything, So that's kind of stupid. He was very successful. So I cranked it up again a few years ago. And once you get by his utter self-confidence and in fact, he was not at all shy about criticizing people to whom he disagreed with, which is practically everybody at one time or another. He was an amazingly successful businessman. He was a baseball businessman and basketball businessman, which makes it even more interesting. And he did a lot for not only his African-American community in Homestead, which is a suburb of Pittsburgh, but nationally in some ways. He did a lot of good things. You just had to get over his personality. As I said in the book, he was admired and respected by his fellow owners, but probably never beloved. But he could have cared less. He wasn't in it to be loved. He was in it to be successful and to bring along the black community behind him to the extent he could influence parts of it.
Well, and obviously, arguably and very posthumously lauded as a member of the Baseball Hall of Fame in 2006, arguably way later than perhaps he should have been. But you're hinting at maybe sort of the foundation of this journey into baseball and business orientation of such, as well as being as a player. This was sort of in the basketball realm, and maybe a little bit of a background in that, because this seems to be kind of his passion during his collegiate years is this basketball thing. And I think also, interestingly, maybe the first time we've kind of stumbled into this, sort of the, I wouldn't call it the Negro Leagues of professional basketball, but certainly the Negro League, if you will, equivalents of, if you will, semi or fully pro basketball, this Black Fives kind of scenario, which even seems even less formed than, say, some of the Negro Leagues. And that's saying something.
Very much so. He was an all-sport athlete at Homestead High School. He was football, basketball, and baseball. And then he played professional basketball and baseball, and he played semi-pro football. Black basketball, were, pretty much entirely segregated at the time. There were no integrated teams, but black and white baseball teams played each other, but black and white basketball teams, at least outside of whatever city you were in, rarely competed against each other. But Posey and other good black players started a semi-pro team in Pittsburgh called the Monticellos, the Monticello Athletic Association, and they got good. And there were probably a dozen high-level black basketball teams between the East Coast and Chicago, say. There was one good one in Chicago. And there was absolutely no league, but they would start, after they got done polishing off the local opposition, which they usually did very easily, they would challenge each other. There'd be these challenges. Generally, you'd try to play each other 3 times during the season. That way someone would win at least 2. And there wouldn't be no question who won the series. But you play at least a couple of games, a home-and-home series. And the black sporting press would sort of coalesce around who was the consensus champion. It was based upon the fact that, well, A beat B and B beat C, so therefore A is the champion. And Posey's team, which was the Monticellos, they went through different iterations of sponsors, but finally the premier black men's social club in Pittsburgh, the Loendi Club, of which Posey's father had been the president at one time and was still a prominent member, sponsored the team. And the Loendis started playing around. They played teams in New York, they played Philadelphia, and they would beat them. And were the consensus black national champions, the nation basically, as I said, running from like New York City to Chicago. They were the consensus black champions 5 years running in the early and mid-20s. Posey himself played, he was a guard, high scorer, usually a high scorer, because in those days the rules allowed, if anyone were fouled and foul shots were awarded, the team could pick a designated shooter. Well, he was usually the designated shooter, and back in the days of the lopsided basketball, he actually was about a 60% foul shooter, which is probably equivalent to a 90% foul shooter today, with a really round ball with no laces on it. And he was considered to be one of the best, if not the best, black professional basketball players in his prime. Against this a consensus opinion of fellow basketball entrepreneurs and sports writers.
Well, at some point, we probably want to delve into this, I guess you could call it, in quotes, the Black Fives era. But I guess this colored, quote unquote, colored basketball world championship, that's what it was called. I'm just curious, before we sort of segue into the baseball and his, if you will, full-time conversion to baseball, I'm just wondering, given especially his entrepreneurial and business interests, I guess, as a sportsman and as a sports businessman over time, why perhaps there wasn't he and or generally more, I don't know, codification or investment or focus perhaps on perhaps building out basketball as much as there seem to be efforts to do so in baseball around that.
I think in the end, except for certain places like big metropolitan areas, New York City, Chicago, there just wasn't enough money in it, not enough fans. You also had, and I think this is true today, of the so-called indoor sports, basketball and hockey, you have to find a place to play. Pretty easy, not totally easy, but it's fairly easy to find a ball field or a football field or a park that would accommodate both football and baseball in season. But you've got to find a gymnasium, and that became a problem because the blacks couldn't play just anywhere, no Madison Square Garden for them. So finding a venue was difficult. The Loendis had dibs on a good location for many years. There in the mid-20s, they lost it, no fault of their own. It was a building owned by the Labor Council in Pittsburgh, and the second floor was the ballroom. And of course, you played basketball anywhere where you could find an open space in those days. So, but then the Labor Council sold the building, and they lost their basketball floor. It was difficult, and this was true of white basketball too. You know, there were regional white leagues in the 20s and 30s, and they all pretty much all died out. In the end, we think of the NBA as roaring onto the scene in the 40s, but it was built upon financially unsustainable predecessors who at least planted the seed that there could be a professional basketball league. So the money just wasn't there. They were losing money, and so were a lot of the other teams, and teams were folding. And he turned the basketball team into a local attraction. You know, by about 1926, he would get some of the better Pittsburgh black players, and in fact, it was someplace that some of his baseball players could make a little money and stay in shape in the off season. But after that, they were strictly a local attraction.
Yeah, and obviously a lot of the early basketball days certainly were tied to companies, corporations, and sort of as things to keep the more athletically inclined occupied during the off hours, so to speak, But again, that's very interesting. So why, though, and how, perhaps, does Cumberland Posey sort of get into the baseball thing? Because it seems like he was kind of playing and or tinkering around, if you will, on the baseball side as well around this time, and then makes the full leap to it, if you will. I'm just curious as to how that emanates?
He became a player, an outfielder on a semi-professional team called the Homestead Grays in 1910 or 1911, and he was just a player, but he was pretty good, and the team was pretty popular, and they had this particular thing. It was a part-time thing. Everybody had a day job, and you played after work or on weekends. Weekends is when you really made your money, obviously. But the president of the organization and the manager, field manager, player manager of the team were devout Christians, and they didn't want the team to play on Sundays, which is when you made your money. So they were encouraged to step aside. I mean, I don't think they were forced aside. They just stepped aside because the rest of the team wanted to be out there on Sundays. Well, Posey became the field manager of the team, and it played on Sundays. They would sort of play anywhere. They would get on streetcars if it was really local. They would pile into a couple of touring cars and go a little farther. They started playing around Pittsburgh, and they were very successful. And then they expanded to Western Pennsylvania, and they were very successful. And they started to play Western Pennsylvania, Eastern Ohio, West Virginia. Busy. Played, I don't know, almost as many games in a season as a major league schedule. And they would make money. They were a good team. They were different. I think let's face it, black teams were a little exotic, maybe in some of these small towns. People would come to see them play, particularly if they were good. So by the early 1920s, he's got a real strong regional setup. They were much admired and much sought after. It got to the point where he could demand, the usual attendance dollar split is for semi-pro, or is like 60% to the home team and 40% to the visiting team, because the home team's got to pay the umpires, they got to maintain the park and everything. Well, Posey was known to demand 75% of the gate to bring his team to your town, but you would pay it happily because you would have 2 or 3 times the people in the seats as you would if you were playing your usual opposition. So there was money to be made. He made it. By the mid-20s, he had reached out to black major league level players who were at odds with their team owners or at loose ends or whatever, and signed them. He gradually replaced the local heroes, including himself, as the left fielder. He put himself out of business as a player, but he meant to do it because he was good, but he wasn't that good. And he was clearly building towards something. We don't know exactly what his goal was at any given time, but he was always moving up. He was building his team to be something better than it was the year before, or the 2 years before, or the 3 years before. And by the mid-20s, he's got some really good players, and they're in great demand around that tri-state area.
This sounds to me, though, that this what you're describing right now this is obviously semi-pro, not even sort of league-based, so to speak. It almost feels like the proverbial barnstorming kind of model. Yeah,
it was. By then, if you had a day job in the steel mills or something like that, you could forget about playing on the Grays. I mean, they were always on the move. They'd go here, they'd go there, they'd play at home or in the Pittsburgh area during the week, and then Saturdays and Sundays, away they'd go. They'd be in Cleveland, they'd be in Youngstown, Ohio, they'd be in Charleston, West Virginia, they'd be halfway across Pennsylvania, and no, they barnstormed a lot.
And who were they playing? Were they playing other pre-Negro League type teams? Were they playing white teams? Were they playing
to some extent?
Okay.
Mostly white teams. They would play lower level in the spring, or by May, they'd be playing lower level minor league white minor league teams for kind of warm ups for both sides. But it was all money. It may not have been an official league game, but it was money for everybody. They would play white teams. They would play industrial and business-sponsored teams in Pittsburgh and all the way into Ohio. Those were almost always white teams. I think probably not integrated teams, although that's a little hard to tell. They had a real home away from home in Akron, Ohio for years, playing team. A lot of the teams in Ohio, oddly enough, were sponsored by tire companies and stuff. I think it was General Tire in Akron. They'd go to, there were other places in Ohio. Denison, Ohio, in that area, had a couple of good white teams that they would play. Yeah, they were, and Western Pennsylvania was just full of them. The mining companies had teams. There was a company called General Tube in Pittsburgh that made literally everything from sewer pipes to flagpoles. If it was long and metal and had a hole in the middle, they made it. And they had a really good team. And so they would play General Tube all the time, 3-4 times a year. So there was just this world of white semi-pro baseball. It was shadowed by, if I may use the term, by this smaller world of black semi-pro baseball, and the Grays moved around in all of it in ever widening circles as they moved way beyond Pittsburgh.
Okay, what's this? Yes, the new book by Diane Shaw. I am happy and ecstatic to recommend it. It's called A Farewell to Arms, Legs, and Jockstraps. Who is Diane Shaw, you may ask, and what's it about? Well, Diane Shaw is a writer of mystery novels and biographies and other great works. But before that, you may have known her in the 1960s and 1970s as the pioneering female sports journalist that kind of broke through the barriers, the glass ceilings, if you will, becoming really the first major national newspaper sports columnist who happened to be female at the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner, for that matter. And her book is just chock full of great anecdotes. It's a memoir of all of her trials and travails, shall we say, in trying to cover sports in this country as a woman. Back in the 60s and 70s, you young whippersnappers, you have no idea how challenging it was. And there's a whole generation and then some of female sports reporters and columnists and writers and on-air personalities who can owe their careers to the doors that she just plowed through back in the day. And some great stories and some great anecdotes. And one that we especially love features a certain United States president and some interesting times when he was running a team and then trying to bulldoze his way through the old USFL, the New Jersey Generals in particular. I'm not going to repeat the story here. It's well worth the price of admission in this book alone. And we highly encourage you to check it out wherever fine books are found. It's called A Farewell to Arms, Legs, and Jockstraps. It is published by the Indiana University Press and their imprint Red Lightning Books. And we thank both of them for offering our listeners an exclusive free chapter download right now. All you have to do is visit this little website. And I'll repeat it again because it's a little clunky. And you're going to get a free special sneak peek, free chapter of the book, A Farewell to Arms, Legs, and Jockstraps. Just go to this website, iupress.org/jockstraps-good seats. That's iupress.org. It's the letter U, press, iupress.org/jockstraps, one word, -good seats, one word. And again, you're going to get a free special sneak peek, a free chapter download of the brand new book by Diane Shaw, A Farewell to Arms, Legs, and Jockstraps. If you don't remember that URL, we'll have a link to it on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com off of this episode. And you will enjoy this book. I guarantee it. And I appreciate our new friends at Red Lightning Books and Indiana University Press, hard to say, for their sponsorship and bringing our attention to this great book by Diane Shaw. He says, A Farewell to Arms, Legs, and Jockstraps. I know you'll enjoy the free sample, and I know you'll enjoy the book. Try it out, and as they say, you'll be glad you did. All right, back to our conversation. Here it comes. It seems like we're getting a sense of Posey's sort of idea that there's quote unquote money to be made. There's a business, so to speak, in this. But I'm also really curious as to, it seems like it's a pretty sort of successful enterprise, if not daunting in terms of travel and getting all the players he needs and being sort of on the move all the time. I guess the flirtations, that's the only word I can come up with right now, of quote unquote league play. And there seem to be a couple of different starting points for that. One in, I guess it was 1929. There's an interesting year to circle, right, with this quote unquote American Negro League. And then again, with this East-West League thing in 32. So give me a sense of maybe why and what these formative leagues were and why maybe the attraction?
You had the first, Rube Foster in Chicago and others founded the first Negro National League in 1920, which was primarily a Midwestern-based league. Then in 1923, the Eastern Colored League started along the eastern seaboard, basically from New York City down to Baltimore and some places in between. Posey had opportunities to join both leagues, and this is what he was so canny. I mean, he would go against the grain if he thought it would work. He resisted joining the leagues for a couple of reasons. One of which was if he didn't belong to the leagues, he could, without real impunity, raid their rosters and sign the best players. And the Grays made money. He said, and this is probably true, that the Grays made money every year until the Depression. There was no overarching commissioner or czar or Judge Landis or whatever of black baseball, and you could go shopping for players. I mean, if you were in the league, there were a lot of restrictions, but if you weren't in the league, you could entice good talent away from somebody who was in the league, and there wasn't a whole lot they could do about it. They could refuse to play you, but then the Grays were such a good draw, they probably wouldn't do that either. He also marketed his Pittsburgh area. The Eastern League stopped short of Pittsburgh. The Western League stopped short of Pittsburgh, but the two leagues would play exhibition games, if you will, with each other. And he said, hey, you're coming east to west, west to east. Why don't you stop in Pittsburgh and play the Grays for a day and then move on? And that worked pretty well, too. He tried to get a formal arrangement, but that didn't really work out. He started to play the Grays started to play Negro League teams by picking them up as they passed through western Pennsylvania en route to either Chicago, say, or Philadelphia or whatever. So he was on the outskirts, on the fringes of league baseball, but he refused to get involved until 1929, when he put the Grays in the American Negro League. And by that point, we think of the Depression, starting with the Wall Street crash in October. But what really was happening was that there was a real decline in American manufacturing starting in about 1927. I mean, the Depression largely started because manufacturers were just making too much. The warehouses were full of refrigerators and furniture and everything else. So we were making more than people could buy. And so manufacturing started to tail off 2 or 3 years before the so-called beginning date of the Depression. That affected black wage earners. They had been the most recently hired, generally speaking, in manufacturing, and they held lower paid positions. Well, you know what they say, last in, first out. So unemployment started to grow in the black community. And the more unemployed there are, the fewer baseball tickets are going to be sold. And Pittsburgh was very industrially based, and this was hurting the white teams too. The white semi-pro teams started to go out of existence because their sponsors could no longer afford to fund them. And I think he looked around and saw his base, which is the regional semi-pro base, money base, was starting to disintegrate, and so he hopped into league. And from then on, if there was a league, the Grays were probably in it. He looked around the financial landscape, saw that his reasons for avoiding the leagues were no longer paramount, so they joined a league. Of course, they were more than welcome because they were always a good draw.
Right, that's interesting. But obviously that version of the American Negro League, right, was literally a one-year wonder, and obviously now in a much more broadly depressed nation and economics and all that stuff, right, beyond the lead-in that you're describing prior to the actual crash and all that, the obviousness of it, I guess, in 29. So, I mean, now I'm really interested in, I get the idea that perhaps there might be sort of strength in numbers and maybe, there's more of a financially advantageous rationale to sort of be within something that's a bit more structured. And obviously that all sort of goes to hell in a handbasket by the end of this 1929 season. How does he, I guess, go back to being an independent team and fumfer along, I guess, for a couple more years? Because that seems to also lead him to the conclusion of maybe going back to the league structure again a few years later, but albeit maybe in with him, I don't know, having designs on how to maybe set one up?
Well, the Negro National League folded in 1932. The Eastern Colored League and the American National League had already gone by the boards, except for the Negro Southern League, which was sort of always considered to be a minor league, but in 32 it was like the last man standing. So they were a major league, even just because they were there. So he actually had very good independent teams in 30 and 31. And in 32, he made what I'd have to say is his only really dumb decision. He started a league in the depths of the Depression called the East-West League. He controlled two teams outright in it, of the six, and probably had a lot to say of the management of the team in Cleveland because it was run by one of his old basketball buddies from Pittsburgh who told everybody, no, this is my money, this is my money. I'm not sure anybody believed him. So Posey literally controlled somewhere between a third to a half of the league. And it didn't work. By July, it was out of business.
Why do you think didn't it work? Was it largely just for all the other reasons that the other leagues were not surviving, and frankly, obviously, other sports?
Worst time in the world
Right.
to start a new baseball league.
Right.
Not even the white majors were doing well in 1932. No one was doing well. I have no idea why he did this. In fact, he was very loath to ever admit he was wrong about anything, but he kind of allowed by the end of 1932 that this wasn't a very good year to try this, which is about the closest he ever came to admitting he was at fault about anything.
But it's also interesting too, because it's my understanding that it was also I want to say it's ahead of its time, but we'll get to that in a second. I think it kind of was, right? But this seemed to be like the first maybe attempt to kind of include teams in what were both, I guess, separate at the time or previous to, both from an Eastern and a Midwestern kind of geographical kind of approach. Ambitious for sure, right? Timely, not necessarily, but the idea of maybe, I don't know, it seems to me it almost was like sort of became the ahead of its time by a couple of years sort of seeds of how to maybe finally once and for all at some point create a standard bearer for pro black baseball league play.
Yes, that's interesting because as integration loomed in the mid-40s, he started to market his solution. And I hadn't really thought of it before, but maybe this is where it started. He had idea of one Negro League. At that time, there were two. There was second Negro National League, which was pretty much Pennsylvania and East Coast based, and then there was the Negro American League, which was the Midwest and the Upper South. And he said, "Look, we can compete. I don't know if history would have proven him right, but he said we can compete with the two white major leagues if we pare our system down to a really strong single black league that stretches from the East Coast to the Midwest with 8 teams worth of the best players. We could be so good we could even challenge the white leagues to a championship series." Now, I don't know if that would ever have worked, but it's an incredibly audacious idea, worthy of Posey. No one took him up on it because, well, primarily the Negro American League wasn't in favor because they would have had to jettison their entire southern tier, which Posey wasn't interested in, and which was really, due to transportation costs, kind of a drag on the whole system anyway. But yeah, he meant there to be a single, powerful black league. He just picked an awful time to try to float his idea. 1932.
Well, it also, but I also get a sense though that there was there was also not only the beginnings of what would come after that, but also tell me about sort of, it almost seems like there was an intra-city or intra-region sort of rivalry with that of the Pittsburgh Crawfords too, right? Because, Gus Greenlee, you had, it seems like Greenlee kind of said, okay, well, we're going to continue to do this, right? Even if the East-West League is not the original or the right path forward, he seemed to be convinced that this was still worth doing. And he actually, did he break away, I guess, and create this Negro National League? I'm just curious as to how Greenlee and Posey were kind of, I don't know, in their own maybe separate ways, kind of still gnawing at that idea of top-tier pro Negro League baseball.
Greenlee didn't break away so much as he filled a vacuum. The East-West League had gone out of business in '32. There were no major leagues except for the Negro Southern League putting along down there in the South. Greenlee had a lot of money. He was in the entertainment business. He owned a nightclub, but mostly he made his money from being the Pittsburgh czar of numbers gambling, which we now know as the state lottery in Arizona or Illinois or Pennsylvania or anywhere. A great money-making business. Particularly, you didn't have to share it with the government because it was all illegal at the time. Greenlee had a lot of money, and the Crawfords were an up-and-coming semi-pro team. They needed financial backing. He liked sports. He had a stable of prize fighters, including John Henry Lewis, who was the middleweight champion of the world at that time. He liked sports. And he bankrolled the Crawfords. And he did what Posey did over a period of 6 or 7 years, which is to say, kind of ease out the local talent and bring in major league quality talent. Greenlee did it in about a year. He started signing these high-level guys, and he told the locals, hey, look, we're now a full-time team. If you don't want to play full-time, you got to leave. And almost all of them left. So the Crawfords became a high-rated team, just as Posey was practically broke by 32. He and his wife almost lost their house to repossession. He signed a lot of Posey's good players away. And the Crawfords became the predominant team for a brief time. And Greenlee then organized the second Negro National League using the name of the first one, although it was almost entirely East Coast based or Northeastern based. And the Grays were allowed in. And the Grays, halfway through the 1933 season, the initial season, the Grays were kicked out because Posey had gone and signed a couple players from the Detroit Stars in the league, violating the rules against player rating. And his thing was, these guys were owed a month's salary, and Detroit hadn't paid them, so I signed them. As far as I'm concerned, they're fair game. It was sort of like the league said, it was one of those things with an employee where the boss says you're fired, and the employee says, you can't fire me, I quit. I'm not sure which happened first, if they were kicked out of the league or he left the league. But at any rate, he was out of the league. So they went back and played independently, and 1934, he rejoined as a associate. The Grays were associate members, which is to say they were not counted in the league standings, but they could play league teams, and they had to keep their hands off the rest of the league's players. A major concession on Posey's part. But they were successful, and by 35, they were back in the league. And they were doing okay. They were not doing great, but they were in the middle of the league. Then Greenlee started to come into money troubles. He was incredibly overextended, and after turning a blind eye on vice in Pittsburgh for years, for political reasons, I'm sure, maybe moral reasons, the city started to crack down on the numbers business. So Posey started to get he started to get his players back. He also got his own money partner, a guy named Rufus Jackson, who was the numbers king of Homestead, who liked sports also and pumped lots of money into the Grays. And the Grays were solvent again and successful, while Greenlee's team was going downhill. And by the end of the 30s, Greenlee was out of the baseball business, and Posey was, by 38, started a string of 9 straight Negro National League championships with the Grays. Posey had a longtime friend named John Clark, who was a journalist and PR man around Pittsburgh, black. But there were Clark went to work for Greenlee, and for 5 years, Clark and Posey battled like wolves in the press about who was right and who was wrong. And then Greenlee went by the boards, and Clark, and Posey had no reason to fight anymore, so they became friends. And one time they're talking after the Crawford's demise, and Posey said to Clark, I always knew I would win because Gus Greenlee never understood the baseball business, which is to say you have to build your base slowly and methodically. You can't just rush in with a bunch of money, because when the money vanishes, so will you. So one of the chapters in the book is called Who Owns Pittsburgh? And it's all about the fight between the two of them, which Posey won. He almost always won because he had incredible staying power.
He almost feels to me like a pioneer, if you will. I don't think it's too light a word in professionalizing, being a sports businessman, right? Before it was really a thing, right? We all know sports being gigantically, well, with some exceptions nowadays, right? Given current conditions, but big time, multi-billion-dollar, enterprises, right? This is way ahead of its time, right? And he's really trying to make a living with this, still fledgling pro baseball thing, right? Of substance and with plenty of obstacles too, given the fact that there's segregation. He almost
never had any other income other than baseball or basketball for a while. Of course, he had Rufus Jackson as a well-moneyed business partner, but that's perfectly allowable. But Posey didn't do anything really after his early 20s but promote sports with teams. And when he died in 46 of cancer, Clark was still a writer for the Pittsburgh Courier, and he wrote a weekly column, which is kind of a little bit about everything going on in the Pittsburgh black community. And he said, Cum was the first Negro I had ever known who set out to make money out of baseball. All the others took a game as a sideline, an excuse to get away from work or home for a day. But even when battling with his back to the wall, he was determined, confident, frank about his position on all matters. He was genuine. He mimicked nobody. He was just Cum Posey, nothing less. And he was just amazingly consistent that way. I mean, I've said many times, I think the only person with whom he ever consistently agreed with in public was the guy he saw in the mirror when he shaved every morning. If you had a criticism of you other than him, he was happy to make it. And not only at meetings or whatever, he was a decent writer. He wasn't he didn't have a great writing style, but he was a perfectly good, straightforward writer. And he wrote off and on a sports column for the Pittsburgh Courier for more than 20 years, in which he would tell you what was going on, and then he would tell you who was screwing up and who wasn't. And that wasn't him, of course. What was wrong? What's wrong with Negro League baseball? Well, I'll tell you. They're not enough organized, this, that, the other. He just was an amazingly consistent, frequently abrasive, but when the world around him, the economic world around him, would allow it to happen, he was just successful all the time.
Well, it sounds like he was also quite good at generating publicity and, if you will, marketing for him, the team, the idea of baseball, Negro League baseball. It seems like he was good at generating interest. Yeah. Yes.
Well, he had a team that didn't lose very much. I mean, they would win, I don't know, 80% of their games when they were playing semi-pros, or more than 80% from the semi-pros. And the low minor leaguers. Then they won from 38 to 45. They won the National League Championship every year. They finished first place. 1 year they lost a postseason playoff to the Baltimore Eli Giants, but frankly, they were in first place when the season was over before the playoffs started, so I count that as one of their league championships.
We could go on for hours, I think, on this, but let me ask sort of two questions, I guess, that I think are important sort of in the general sort of thread of both the team and Posey's management and running of the team. Number one, I guess, is just the sheer staggering number of quality baseball players at the time, and historically, count them 12, including Posey himself. So let's say 11 National Baseball Hall of Famers. To talk about the talent, how he was able to corral this great talent, some of those names, because that phenomenal when you look at it sort of through the lens of history. It's amazing.
He had a great eye for talent, and he had the money to pay these guys, whether they were at loose ends, like Joe Williams was. Smokey Joe Williams pitched for the Grays in the 30s, and he was over 40, and his team in New York had sort of given up on him. Posey hired him really to be sort of his assistant manager, but it turned out he had plenty left in his arm, and he had about 5 more good years pitching. He picked up players like Oscar Charleston. He lured them away from when they were in non-league status. He lured them away from league teams by paying them more money. And he said, "Look, we pay better than anybody else, and we pay on time, and we pay every 2 weeks," which was not always the case with some of these more profligate or money-strapped owners. Yeah, there are about, when you take out the pre-Negro League and owners from the 35 members of the Hall of Fame, it leaves about 25 people that Posey theoretically could have signed because they were playing in his time period, and he's got 11 of them. That's a pretty good record.
Oh, it's amazing. I mean, Cool Papa Bell, Ray Brown, you mentioned Oscar Charleston, Martin Diego, Bill Foster, Josh Gibson, Judy Johnson, Buck Leonard, of course, who gained a whole lot of fame with the baseball series with Ken Burns and helping reignite interest in the Negro Leagues. Obviously, Posey himself, Judd Wilson, Smokey Joe Williams, and Willie Wells. I mean, these are now okay. So one last question on that front, then. So looking at a chart now of all of when these gentlemen were all inducted, why do you think it took until 2006 for Posey to get inducted when a whole bunch of these players, just about the majority of them, were inducted as early as the 70s.
Well, the special committee in the 70s installed 9, including Leonard, Josh Gibson, Satchel Paige, Johnson. Then it was turned over to the Veterans Committee, and they picked Rube Foster. And then at some point, the Hall of Fame had 2 panels of experts put together lists from 2 underserved, if you will, areas, which are 19th century white players and Negro Leaguers. And the Veterans Committee could look at these lists every year. They didn't have to pick anybody, but they could. Well, fortunately, Buck O'Neill was a member of the Veterans Committee at that point. And so several more got in. But it was all, other than Foster, it was all concentrated on players. You can understand that. The players are the meat, the real bread and butter of the operation as far as the fans are concerned. But that left the owners high and dry. And in 2006, the Hall put together the special committee. I'm happy to say I was on it. And we kind of fixed the underrepresentation of owners we elected 4. So I think they're all good candidates. In fact, there are probably a couple other good candidates who didn't make the cut. Posey and James L. Wilkinson, who, although being white, ran the most successful black team in the Midwest at the same time that Posey was running the best team in the East. Effa Manley, and Alex Pompez, who ran the New York Cubans. So that's sort of, it was real. I mean, we looked at that list in 2006, and then basically a lot of players on it people said, why weren't these people already in? Well, they weren't in because the process didn't work very well. So we kind of doubled the number of black baseball figures in the Hall of Fame in 1 year. I don't know if they'll ever let us do it again.
Well, I'm glad I asked the question. I'm glad I asked you that question then. But also too, it's also heartening to have seen since obviously the Negro League Hall of Fame in Kansas City, which can certainly in its own way right some wrongs as well as perhaps even go deeper into more of the detail, I guess, of some of these players that don't, for whatever reasons, don't sort of make sort of the grand hall for whatever reasons. All right, here's my last sort of question, and I'm sorry I'm waiting till the end of this conversation to kind of ask it, but a curiosity to me is, and I get a sense now as a businessman, maybe perhaps why this was the case. Explain to me this, for lack of a better term, adopted home of Washington, D.C., because I think a lot of people who come across the Homestead Grays for the first time don't necessarily understand it being sort of a Pittsburgh regional domiciled kind of club. They may have become aware of it because of their doings in play and the writings about it in Washington, D.C. I don't get where that comes from.
During the war, Washington's black population boomed because the federal government was providing was growing during the war. It needed employees, and it was essentially non-discriminatory, probably not entirely, but mostly. And African Americans went there for jobs. And they were good jobs. They were government jobs. Now you have people who do have money to buy tickets. The major league owners who own their own parks, which is basically all of them, love to rent those parks on days when their teams weren't playing, because you got to pay the electric bill, the water bill, the debt service, whatever, even if there's nothing going on but somebody out there mowing the grass. So they love to rent out their parks to other sporting opportunities, and Negro League baseball was one of them. Clark Griffith was happy to do this. Posey seized the opportunity. It's only 250 miles from Pittsburgh to D.C., and these Negro Leaguers. One of them once told me, "I got so used to sleeping on a bus. When we'd stop at a hotel, we couldn't sleep. We'd have to walk the streets all night because we couldn't sleep in a bed during the season. So you'd play a game at Forbes Field in Pittsburgh on Saturday. You'd hop on the bus, You drive in during the night and wind up in Washington, D.C. in the morning, get ready and play like a doubleheader in Griffith Stadium in D.C. They did amazingly well. It was a real moneymaker. And, and also, of course, you were publicizing black baseball in a place where the activities of blacks got covered. So they were in the Washington papers and then of course they were the Grays. They were always successful. That's how that came about. It's just seized an opportunity and took it just at the right time.
Why not move outright? Was there still enough money to be made within the Pittsburgh Homestead region too, or why separate it between two teams and maybe dilute?
The black population in Pittsburgh was not in a growth mode at that point. And I'm not sure why, to be honest with you. But you look at the census data, and it clearly wasn't. So while they were successful in Pittsburgh, it had sort of leveled off. But here you had, not far away by Negro League bus travel standards, here you had this potential gold mine. And actually the first couple of years, it wasn't all that successful. It was okay, but nothing that probably justified all of this disruption. But then it got better. They got a better PR man. Also, they persuaded the Kansas City Monarchs to come and play several times. And of course, they had Satchel Paige on their roster. And whenever Paige pitched at these neutral parks, major league parks, attendance would double. Negro League attendance would double. And so Paige came and pitched a few games, and the attendance went through the roof. Again, they hired a guy named Art Carter, who was a sports writer for the Baltimore Afro-American, to be their PR guy. And Carter was very savvy. He courted the upper class, the doctors, the lawyers, the higher government, middle-level government officials with tickets, and got them convinced that it wasn't being looked down upon to go to a ball game. And what do they call them now? Influencers. These people became influencers, and the fans started, and the fans followed them. So, yeah, the first couple of years it didn't, and they almost gave up on it. But then they did, did cast about and hit on the right formula, and it worked like crazy. Satchel Paige being a big part of it.
All right. Well, here's my last question, and I'll let you promote. Give me a sense then, sort of looking, and obviously, the decline of the Negro Leagues, the integration of baseball, and obviously sort of swept up the Grays too, among all the other sort of successes by that time in the late 40s, early 50s. But give me a sense of what you take away from the legacy. I know it's a sort of oft used and thrown around word, but of not only Posey, but also the Grays and their sort of, I don't know, what they meant not only to Negro League baseball, but baseball generally. Because it seems like there was some, and again, I throw this term around, but I think it's apt, is there's some pioneering going on in this story.
Yes, there is. They've set the stage. They set the stage for integration, really, because by the late 30s, everybody, including some white sports writers, Jimmy Powers in New York and Hayward Broun, were saying, "Why aren't these guys in the majors? We've seen these guys play; they're great. Why aren't they in the majors?" So that, in the wartime, blacks were in the Army, blacks were in the Navy, blacks were in the Air Force, the Tuskegee Airmen, all of that. By the time the war is over, Truman officially desegregates the military. And it's like, well, now's the time. Branch Rickey was secretly out in front of the whole thing, was scouting and evaluating black players, and integration happened in 46 and 47 to start with, and then by 50 it was pretty wide, at least most teams had at least one black player. I guess that's widespread. And it was like pulling the plug on the Negro Leagues because, wow, we can go see Jackie Robinson, we can go see Willie Mays, we can go see Roy Campanella, Don Newcomb in the real big leagues. And the Negro Leagues just went from real prosperity, and by not, as late as 1946 to scrabbling around by the end of the decade. It's just, the reversal was amazing, and they dropped out of sight. So, yeah, they were pioneers. Unfortunately, they were unrecognized pioneers for then a couple of decades until the Hall of Fame started to invent Negro Leaguers. Bob Peterson wrote his seminal book, Only the Ball Was White. John Hallway interviewed everybody to get his hands on and turned those oral histories into 2 or 3 books that we all still read today, because these stars and owners have passed, and John got it all down on paper from him. It's weird. We're still rebuilding a legacy that frankly should never have died out. We shouldn't be doing what we're doing today. Posey should have had a biography 20 years ago. Maybe I should not have stopped then 20 years ago. I don't know. But yeah, it's sort of very strange. We're still finding out details about people. The statistics, which were not kept well at the time, are being rehabilitated, particularly by the Negro League database at sceneheads.com, which is they have the most complete set of statistics at this point, and they're still working on them. Still happy to get a previously unknown box score in the mail or whatever and add it to their database. Yeah, we're all working like crazy at something that should have been done 25 years ago, but it wasn't. So here we are.
All righty, then. There we go. Lots to still discover, not only about the Homestead Grays, one of the most legendary teams of the Negro Leagues by far, but the Black Fives. We want to get into more of that. The Loendi Black Five that Posey played on, and all the Harlem Globetrotter stories embedded in there, and all kinds of great stuff yet to discover. It's actually, we know that the Negro Leagues were relatively, I wouldn't call them ragtag, right? Because there were certainly lots of established leagues and teams. But obviously, as we've discovered in our journeys together in the Negro Leagues, not sort of the most easily discovered and or verifiable sometimes. So it's getting better, of course, with the Negro League Hall of Fame in Kansas City, and all kinds of other great scribes and scholars trying to sort of right the wrongs and sort of piece together the various missing fragments of this still evolving Negro League story. But my sense is, and I could be wrong, that the Black Fives era of basketball is even sort of more tattered, shall we say, in terms of a sort of fully constructed narrative and sort of definitive kind of history. But we're going to get into more of that, hopefully, for sure. And we certainly will look for opportunities to get into more of the Black Fives era basketball scene, because those are, I would argue, even more misunderstood or not even known about roots for what is now arguably one of the biggest sports machineries on the planet, that being the National Basketball Association and the pro basketball game writ large. But Jim Overmyer is the excuse for getting us into both of these topics this week, and we appreciate him being part of our little festivities once again. His book on Cumberland Posey of the Homestead Grays is out now in paperback form. It is published by our friends at McFarland. You can find it wherever good books are found. And there's a bunch of other stuff that Jim has written. Obviously, the history of the Atlantic City Bacharach Giants. He's got a seminal biography of Effa Manley. All those great books, you'll see those listed on this episode listing on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode, number 168. Oh, my God. Of this show, and you'll find convenient links to those books, as well as, by the way, on the site, all those episodes I just sort of hinted at. You can download them, you can share them, you can stream them, do whatever you want. All of those episodes are there for you to enjoy, as well as all the books and media or whatever. If our guests have, been pitching stuff that they've written or produced, you'll find convenient links there too. And of course, when you make purchases through those links, usually through Amazon, but also through Apple and other places, we get a little scratch, if you will, for that, and that keeps the show going. And we appreciate if and when you do so very much, because we could always use a little extra change, keep the lights on and keep that sort of midnight oil burning as we go to the mat for you each and every week, trying to find great stories to share with you. If you'd like to follow us on social media, you can do that too. On Instagram, we're at Good Seats Still Available. On Twitter, you'll find us at Good Seats Still. You'll find an Instagram. I already said Instagram, didn't I? Gosh darn it. Facebook. Yeah, that's it. This is the thing I want to forget. There you go. But until we do forget it for good, there is a little Facebook page devoted to us. You can follow us there too, if you'd like. If you'd like to send us an email, of course you can do that. We are available at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And we also have a little weekly email newsletter we'd like to send out on the weekends, which give our subscribers a little bit of a head start for the current or the upcoming week's episodes. And you can find a link to that on our website again at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search around there. You'll find the little web page there that'll just ask for your name and your email address, and on that list you will be, and we look forward to sending that to you, of course. Thank you, of course, as we wrap up things here this week. It's Jerry Payne. Hi, Jerry. How you doing? He's not listening to me because it's already been recorded and we've already put it out on the internet. But anyway, we of course always want to thank him because he does a great job helping us produce our episodes each and every week. He has not run screaming this week. Someday we'll probably cause him to cry uncle and run for the Z Hills. But this is not the week. But we do, of course, appreciate his efforts. And we, of course, appreciate you to no end for listening not only this far, but to all of our great shows and all your great commentary. We love it. We appreciate it. We hope that you will stay safe. You will be socially conscious. You will do all the right things to make this world a better place, because God knows we could use more of that these days. Hopefully we are a good little respite from the crazy world out there, and we look forward, of course, to seeing you with hopefully another episode next week. Until then, thank you tremendously, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.